Well, welcome to Money in the Constitution. This is the sixth lecture in the Constitution seminar series. And today's kind of a wild ride. Talk about money. I'll be the first to admit that I don't understand everything about money. It's a very complex system. But I also be the first to say that I really think and I really sincerely hold that the Constitution is very, very clear on some very basic principles that would make our money system very simple. If we did what the Constitution asked us, we'd really be able to have a monetary system that is based on true principles of freedom. So I wanted to start out, I like to start with this slide because a lot of times we hear the word million and billion and trillion, and really we have no idea what that means. All we know is it means a bunch of zeros, right? Tons of money. Let's look at an example. This is this is probably about 2 years old. This information you'll notice right away because the money is not as big as it is these days in 2013. U.S. tax revenue, $2.17 trillion, okay? That's what $2.17 trillion looks like. The federal budget is $3.8 trillion. You should notice right away there's a problem. We spend 3.8, we take in 2.17, okay? There's a little bit of a deficit there, isn't there? So the new debt every year is $1.65 trillion, and of course those numbers have grown. This information is about 2 years old, like I said, okay? So $1.65 trillion in new debt. Now that's what is called a deficit. Sometimes people don't understand the terms. A deficit is a yearly measurement, okay? We spend 3.8, we take in 2.17, therefore we have a yearly new debt deficit of $1.65 trillion. Now the national debt, here's where you can tell right away this is old information because we're already past 17 trillion, okay? But a couple years ago we were at 15 trillion. $15 trillion in national debt, and that's a cumulative number. National debt gets added to every year. Okay, it's a grand total number. Unfunded liabilities. What are unfunded liabilities? What's a liability? Is it something good or bad? Liability is bad. And unfunded, that's a bad, okay? You have no idea how you're going to pay for this thing that you owe. Unfunded liabilities, at least 114 trillion. That number, just depending on which generally accepted accounting practice you use, right? It could be way more than 114 trillion, but at least 114 trillion dollars of unfunded liabilities. The great majority of this is from our Social Security and from Medicare, okay? Now the recent budget cuts, sometimes we get on the legislator's case and say, come on guys, for heaven's sakes, take a real chunk out of this, really cut back somewhere. And they say, okay, well we're going to get serious. We're going to take out $38.5 billion, okay? That's a lot of money that they cut back. Now, in order to understand what all these numbers mean, because like I said, billions, trillions, it just kind of goes off into nowhere, into oblivion. Let's look at this as if it were a household budget. What I've done is I've taken off 8 zeros in order to give us a perspective of what we're talking about here. My annual family income, let's say, is $21,700, okay? So you can see how what essentially what I've done is taken off the 8 zeros. Is it 2.17 trillion? Well, now it's only 21,700. Just take off those 8 zeros and you have a new number. The annual family budget then is $38,200, okay? I'm spending $38,000 and I'm only taking in roughly $22,000. Okay, you see how I did that? The comparison there, the upper numbers there, just taking off those eight zeros. So the new debt on my credit card each year as a family, because I have no other way to pay for it, is $16,500. Wait, I'm making $22,000 and I'm putting on my credit card an additional $16,000? I'm spending $38,000, so I have no other choice but to put $16,000 every year on my credit card? Is that out of control? It's completely out of control, isn't it? Now, not to worry, my outstanding balance on my credit card is $150,000, and I'm adding $16,000 every year to that. Okay? This is the story of my family household budget, but really what's it the story of? It's the story of the U.S. government. And you can see how upside down we are monetarily. Now, future obligations, these unfunded liabilities, right? I have 7 kids, and they're going to have some awesome weddings and etc. I have to pay for college. I know that I'm on the hook for $1.14 million. I owe that somehow in the future. I'm going to pay for that somehow in the future, in the next 10 to 15 years. Okay? This looks like a very rosy picture for my budget, my family budget. No, it doesn't even come close to being logical, does it? So my wife and I sit down and say, we're going to be serious. We are going to cut back. We need to cut back. Okay? We say, you know what, we're going to cut back $385. That's right, $385. That's it. And we're supposed to be praised for being serious about cutting our budget, right? Really? You're going to cut $385 when you owe that much money on your credit card and have future obligations? So you can see how it's really comical how much the Congress cut back. And the little asterisk next to that is the idea that they really didn't cut back at all. All they did was reduce future increases by $385 billion, or $38.5 billion. All they did is decrease future increases. So they still increase, just not as much. And we're supposed to praise them for being serious about cutting back on the budget, okay? So anyway, this slide to me helps clarify what kind of situation we're in. We're in a hole. We're upside down, okay? So monetarily, we have some things to look at. I like this quote by George Washington. This contextually here, this is after they'd won the war for independence, okay? And he said, this is after that, so you're thinking, well, gosh, once they've won the war for independence, things should be peachy, right? This should be rosy. But here's the quote that Washington offers. He says, if any person had told me that there would have been such a formidable rebellion as exists, I would have thought him fit for a madhouse. What's going on here? 1787, we already won the war for independence 4 years ago. Things should be good, right? If someone had told me what a formidable rebellion existed, I'd have said, you're nuts. No, we just won the war, remember? Things are good. And yet they weren't, were they? Things were crazy. Europe was waiting. The European nation was waiting for us to fall apart again. A lot of them didn't even leave our continent. They had their own forts still in our land waiting to take over Britain and France. One of the telling stories is our continental dollar. Okay, we printed the continental dollar to pay for our war debts, to pay our soldiers, to pay supplies, etc. Continental dollar, when it came out, was worth $1, right? And by the end of just a few years, it was only worth 2 pennies. Okay? It had been inflated so much that it was only worth 2 pennies at that point. There were some huge problems. The states were fighting. Some citizens were killing each other. There was all kinds of chaos. There was a literal rebellion on their hands. Okay? And the monetary situation was one of the biggest things. Because money-wise, this continental dollar was only worth 2 pennies. It's supposed to be worth $1. It was worthless, essentially. Okay? Let's look at another quote by George Washington. And this quote was in 1791. Okay? In 1791, what had happened between 1787, when he said his previous quote, and then 4 years later? What had happened is the Constitution. Okay? Here's what he said: tranquility reigns. As opposed to 4 years ago. Tranquility reigns. Our public credit stands on the high ground which 3 years ago would have been considered a species of madness to have foretold. Okay? What happened? Like I said before, what happened is the Constitution. Were they in dire straits? Did they have some major monetary problems? They did. And what did they do? They implemented true principles of freedom in the Constitution, and the result was tranquility reigning and public credit standing on high moral ground, where they could get their country in order again. Now, some people say, we're beyond hope. Our monetary system is gone. And I would say, why don't we look to what the founders did? What George Washington proclaimed was, look, go to the Constitution, apply those principles, and we can save our monetary system. So we're going to spend our time today looking at the principles of the Constitution in regards to money. And really, it's a beautiful thing. I hope you get excited about it as I do. So let's start out with some definitions like we always do. What's money? Money is any article or substance used as a medium of exchange, a measure of wealth, or means of payment. That's what money is. Okay? It's important to understand that government didn't create money. Money was a natural phenomenon that happened between people. Okay? I want what you have. I don't have what you want. So what if I give you this thing that you can use with someone else to get what you want? That thing's called money. That wasn't created by government. It was created by naturally thinking and acting human beings. Okay? What are some characteristics that money should have? Well, first of all, money should have some type of intrinsic worth. Okay? If you choose something like trash to be your money, it's not going to last very long because no one even wants it in the first place. It should have some type of intrinsic worth to it. Okay? It should also be divisible. Because in the marketplace of goods and services, buying and selling, trading, if your money, the very smallest common denominator of it is some huge chunk, and you can't divide it, how do you participate in the smaller commercial transactions? It has to be divisible. You have to be able to divide it into smaller and smaller increments. Okay? Thirdly, your money should be portable. If you have to hook up your trailer and load up this huge piece of money to take it into market every day and to use in your commercial transactions, that's not going to work very well. It should be something that's portable, easy to be carried. It should be durable, because if you drop your money on the ground and it shatters, or if you sit on it wrong and it whatever, that's not going to be very good money because it's not durable. It's not going to last. Or if it oxidizes, or if it gets wet and it erodes, That doesn't work very well. You need to have money that lasts, okay, that's durable. Lastly, it should be relatively scarce, because if you choose money to be like sand, and so, oh, well, here's my money. It's so plentiful. It's not scarce at all. It's so plentiful that it has no value because it's just commonly found everywhere. If it's not scarce, it's not going to have any value, okay? So those are 5 attributes of what money should be. And people use different types of money throughout the history of the world. They've used fish, things that are edible. Tell me about fish's durability. The first day, it's an asset, right? After the end of the first day, it becomes a liability. No one even wants it anymore. You can't use it as money. So its durability is not very good. So fish didn't last too long. It's nice for a simple economy, but it doesn't have any durability, okay? What about shells? Durability again, right? You sit on those things, they break. What about the uniformity? You have this little conch shell that's a little bit bigger than the other conch shell. Well, how much is it worth? Well, it depends. It gets very complex, doesn't it? There's not some uniformity there. What about cows? Tell me about their portability. How portable are cows to be used as money? They've been used as money in the past. They're not that portable, are they? They're fairly inconvenient to use. What about their divisibility? What if I want to trade some of my cow for your chickens? I'm going to have to lop off and kill my money in order to get some of your chickens. And you're not going to want my money anymore because it's a killed cow, right? So there's some issues there as well. So what throughout history has been most commonly used as money? It's always been gold and silver. Why is that? Because gold and silver has won out in the free market of ideas. It is the most durable, portable, divisible, relatively scarce, intrinsic worth substance that there is. It wins. Not because government edict, not because they said it shall be, but because people said this is what works the best. This is what is the most qualifying for the terms of what we want money to be. Another interesting thing about money or about gold and silver and why it's good money is 3 other elements. The first one is it's homogeneous, right? You have an ounce of a diamond. Is it necessarily the same value as another ounce of diamond? No, it depends on its cut and clarity and all that stuff, right? When you buy an engagement ring, they try to tell you about the 4 C's, okay? The other thing is it's used and valued in every culture throughout the world for religious purposes, construction purposes, etc., decorative purposes. It's universally accepted. And thirdly, it has a high value to weight ratio, okay? What little piece of gold is worth a lot. It's not that there's not enough coal that it has the same value as gold, but you'd have to have the whole room full of coal to equal one little tiny speck of gold, right? So it's a high value to weight ratio. Now, in our modern enlightened age, we've rejected some basic ideas about the value of money, and now we have 3 different types of money. The first type of money is commodity money. That's the one we just talked about. Commodity, what do you think about when I say commodity? Wheat, grains, those types of things. Commodity actually has value itself. Gold and silver coin has value itself, okay? Second type of money is this money called fiduciary. Notice the little yellow stamp on this piece of money. Fiduciary, what's that mean? It means trust, okay? The piece of paper has no value except for the fact that you can trust that you can turn it in for gold and silver, the real money, the commodity money, okay? And we've taken it one step further and said, oh, our last type of money is fiat money. What's fiat mean? Fiat means edict. Mandate. It's worth that because the government says it's worth that, and that's it. There's nothing backing it up. It's simply the full faith and credit of the United States government. They say it is, therefore it is. Okay, that's fiat money. Now, let's make a little comparison here. We got a monopoly money, and we've got the fiat money. Our current fiat money is called the Federal Reserve Note, okay? People call it a dollar, but its real name is a Federal Reserve Note. When you look at it, it even says that, Federal Reserve Note at the top. $1, but it's really a Federal Reserve Note. Now, how are they any different? How is this $100 bill different than the $100 Monopoly bill? Well, it's got higher quality paper, higher quality ink, we hope. But when you're playing Monopoly and you have this yellow $100 bill, what can you do with that? Can you buy houses? Can you buy properties? Can you buy hotels? Yeah. Right? And no one can say you can't. So yeah, I can. According to the rules of the game, I can use my money to buy whatever I want to buy. Okay? When the game's over, though, can you take your $100 yellow Monopoly bill and go across the street and buy some tools with it? No. Why? Because the game's over. You're not playing Monopoly anymore. As long as we're playing the games of the Federal Reserve, then the Federal Reserve Note works. But what happens in the game of the Federal Reserve Note is over. It's just a piece of paper. Now, Voltaire, who's a socialist, I don't like to quote him very often, but Voltaire said, paper money will always return to its intrinsic value, which is paper. Zero, nothing. It's just paper. Okay? And that's what happened. Paper money is just paper. Okay? And that's an important point to understand. One other thing, I've done this presentation quite a few times, and it dawned on me one day, wait, there's another way this is monopoly money. How is it monopoly money? Because the federal government has given the power, the monopoly power, over legal tender to the Federal Reserve Note. The Federal Reserve Note is the only legal tender. It has monopoly over legal tender status in the United States. That's another way it's monopoly money, because they have that monopoly over the market. Okay? Okay, so what is a dollar? I've got an object lesson for you here. I've got a $20 bill. Okay, it's actually a $20 Federal Reserve Note. We call it a $20 bill. If I were to take your $20 bill and say, hey, I'll give you $1 for your 20, would anyone take me up on that? No? Why would I do that? And what if I clear my throat and say, no, sorry, you didn't understand. What I'm going to do, I'll give you $1 for your 20. Who would take me up on it then? Anybody would, right? Yeah, give me your dollar. Well, wait a second. Why when I said I'll give you $1 for 20, did you say no? And then I say, well, no, if I give you $1 for 20, you say yes. So what's a dollar? I'm confused. This $20 bill, remember, it's not a $20 bill, it's a $20 Federal Reserve Note. And this dollar, it actually has what in it? It's actually commodity money. It has silver in it. That's why people say, yes, I want this, even though it's only one of these and 20 of these. Okay? Let's look at that a little bit more closely to understand that. So what's a dollar? Okay, this little coin you see here, this is interesting. It's called a Spanish piece of 8. Okay? The dollar that was in circulation at that time was called the Spanish milled dollar. It was also called the Spanish piece of 8, or it was also called a column dollar, okay? The reason it's called the Spanish piece of 8 because it was scored on the back. You could pop it in half, you could pop it in quarters, and you could pop it in eighths. And each eighth was called a bit. Anyone heard 8 bits a dollar? Okay? 2 bits a quarter? That's where it comes from. Now another little thing about this is called a column dollar. Like I said, it's because these little columns you see on it. Okay? Now these columns are surrounded by an S-shaped little ribbon. So as I click here and we work through what this looks like, what is that? That's the dollar sign, isn't it? That's where dollar sign came from, was from the Spanish milled dollar. Okay? So what is this thing we call a dollar? The dollar is actually mentioned twice in the Constitution, once in Article 1, Section 9, Clause 1, and once in the 7th Amendment. Okay? But the founders never defined what a dollar was. They just simply said the word dollar. So, historically, Jefferson had an archenemy. His name was Hamilton. They were both on opposite sides of a lot of different issues. But in this definition, in this idea, they needed to come up with a definition of what the dollar was. They're on the same page. Okay, what they did is they went into the market and found out this Spanish milled dollar that was being circulated. We need to do a scientific experiment, find out how much silver is in it. Okay, so they simply took a market analysis. They didn't politicize it. They didn't campaign. They simply took a market analysis, found that some had been rubbed thin and some had been rubbed off the edge. And out of their sample, they found that there was, on average, 371.25 grains of fine, showy silver in each dollar. And so, under the Mint Act of 1792, one of the very first acts of the very first Congress, they defined a dollar to be 371.25 grains of fine, showy silver. That is the definition of what a dollar is, okay? It's a mass. It's a definition. It's a scientific number. It's not a politicized or governmentally manipulated idea. The dollar is simply a measurement of content of silver in the coin. Okay? It's interesting. It's important to understand that. That's the basis behind the whole monetary system, is that it can't be changed by government. It's simply defined, and then the people themselves are the ones who decide on what that thing is worth, what the value of the dollar is. Will it buy me a chicken? Will it buy me? That just depends on the market. Okay? Now let's get the founder's view on money. Washington says this: if we should use unfunded paper money or any similar species of fraud, we shall assuredly give a fatal stab to our national credit in its infancy. Okay? It's talking about unfunded paper money. Like this stuff? Yeah. If we use unfunded paper money, he calls it what it is. It's a fraud. It's a fatal stab. He says, paper money will invariably operate in the body of politics as spirit liquors on the human body. They prey on the vitals and ultimately destroy them. He's talking about liquors, right? It's a great analogy, because what do you do when you're drunk? You make a bunch of bad decisions and you just do more and more and more. That's what happens, and that's the intoxicating power of paper money. Just more and more paper money. That'll fix it. Just pour money into it. That'll fix it. That doesn't fix it, does it? Now, this quote from Washington: paper money has had the effect in your state. This is a letter that he sent to a friend. Paper money has had the effect in your state that it'll ever have. to ruin commerce, to oppress the honest, and to open the door to every species of fraud and injustice. That's what happens with paper money. Okay? Jefferson, you're starting to get a feel for how they felt about paper money, okay? Jefferson says, paper is poverty. It is only the ghost of money and not money itself. Notice that whenever the founders talk about money, they're talking about money, right? Commodity money, real money. And when they use the adjective paper money, they're talking about paper, right? They're very clear. Jefferson says it's not money, it's the ghost of money, okay? This is money. Madison says this, the extension of the prohibition to bills of credit must give pleasure to every citizen in proportion to his love of justice and his knowledge of the true springs of public prosperity. There's a lot of words in there, and they spoke a lot more eloquently. Okay, so I'm breaking it down into modern day English, okay, interpreting what the founder said. He says this, Americans will be happy to know that under the Constitution, government-issued paper money is prohibited. That's what he's saying. Because if you understand the true springs of prosperity, understand that government being restricted from issuing paper money is that true spring. Another quote from Jefferson says, the trifling economy of paper is a cheaper medium. In other words, look, I understand. There's an economic value in having paper because it's cheaper. It's cheaper to produce. You'd call it money. It's way cheaper than coining money, okay? That's true. I'll give that to you. It says the second thing is it's convenient for transmission. No question, easier to carry one of these that has 10,000 on it than to carry 10,000 of these, right? It's more convenient to transmit these. So that's true. I'll give that to you. But that weighs nothing in opposition to the advantages of the precious metals. Paper money is liable to be abused, has been, is, and forever will be abused in every country in which it is permitted. True, okay? Historically, people can't resist the temptation to abuse paper money, to create money out of thin air simply by printing it, okay? That's what always has happened, always will happen. Okay? Now, there's some famous founding fathers, right? Madison, Washington, Jefferson. What about some of the less famous ones? What about some of their comments in the Constitutional Convention? Well, let me give you a couple indications how they felt. Oliver Ellsworth from Connecticut says this, shut and bar the door against paper money. Okay? James Wilson, remove the possibility of paper money. Pierce Butler from South Carolina, disarm the government of such power. And lastly, John Langdon said it pretty clearly, I will reject the whole Constitution if paper money is not barred. Why? Because the power to destroy the monetary currency of the country is the power to destroy the country. Okay? They're intertwined together. And to give the government the power to defraud the people through printing money is something the founders rejected completely and entirely. Over and over. We've seen dozens of quotes already, right? Very clear they were against paper money. Okay, so now let's get into the Constitution. Let's see where these cool ideas actually show up, just like we do in all our presentations, right? Here's neat quotes, neat principles. How do they show up in the Constitution? We're going to start with Article 1, Section 8, Clause 5. Congress shall have power to coin money, regulate the value thereof in a foreign coin, and fix the standard of weights and measures. Okay? We're going to start from the bottom up. There's 3 or 4 different clauses in there. First one, to fix the standard of weights and measures. Why would it be important for Congress to be able to set the standard for weights and measures? Let's say in commerce, every state gets to set their own definition of what a pound is. Hey, I want to buy a pound of honey from you. Oh, are you talking about a Floridian pound or a Wyoming pound? No. We're going to give that power to Congress to set a fixed standard for weight and measures. Otherwise, commerce just gets slowed down with this intricacy of it doesn't need to happen that way. We need to have the standardized weights and measures. Okay? I think that one's pretty clear. Now, the second part here is to regulate the value thereof in a foreign coin. Okay? So Congress has the power, the ability to regulate the value of foreign coin. How would they do that? Does that mean they just go around and tell everyone what their coins are worth? No. But they can tell America within our economic system how much each foreign coin is worth based on what? On a vote or a politicized event? No, based on a fact. If the Congress finds a reputable mint in Japan that mints a coin that has 371.25 grains of fine silver in it consistently, Congress can say that coin from Japan is worth how much? $1. Okay? What if they find a coin from a mint in Austria that consistently has 742 some odd ounces of silver in it, twice as much silver? They're going to say that coin, the Austrian coin, is worth $2. Okay? Now, interestingly, historically, gold and silver gold's been about 16 times the value of silver. Okay? And so What if there was a gold coin minted in Australia that had 371.25 grains of gold in it? It'd be worth $16. Okay? But notice it's all pegged to what? To silver. It's all pegged to a commodity. It's all pegged to an actual mass amount. It can't be politicized or manipulated or inflated or created. It simply is. It's a weight, and if it has that much silver in it, it's worth this much in our economy. Okay? That's the power they have. And what does that do? It coincides with the proper role of government. Their role, their job is to protect the life, liberty, and property of the people. Not to influence and change and manipulate the value of the dollars, but simply to set it. And so that people can be secure and know that what they're dealing in is the actual money and not something they can change in a whim of a government or a political party or a campaign slogan. Okay? Now, they have the value to regulate our coined money as well. Okay? What does that mean? Same thing, right? If we have a coin that comes out, it's got a picture of Madison's head on it, and it has 371.25 grains of silver, it's going to be worth $1. 742 grains of fine silver, $2, etc. They can regulate our own coins and determine the value thereof. This last one, Congress shall have power to coin money. Now, some people argue that the power to coin money just means the power to make money, the power to print money. It's all there. It's all the same thing. Is it the same thing? I argue that it's not the same thing, and I think the founders would argue that it's not the same thing at all. And that's why the plain language of the Constitution says they have the power to coin money, not print money, not make money, to coin money. Why? Because paper and coins are two different things. This thing can be printed in the thousands per minute, right? This thing, it's metal. It's a precious metal. It's a commodity. You don't just create this out of thin air. This, you essentially do create it out of thin air. Okay? There's a difference there. Now, another important point to make in coining money, all that Congress is doing is they're sticking their stamp of approval on a piece of metal that says, we in the U.S. government recognize this has a certain content, purity, and weight to it, and therefore is $1, therefore is 371.25 grains of silver. That's all we're doing, is putting our stamp of approval to say it is what it claims to be. That's all. Okay? They're not politicizing or manipulating the money market. They're simply verifying what it is. And that is in complete compliance with what government's proper role is, to protect the property of the people through regulating the value of their coins based on facts, not based on politics. Does that make sense? That's incredibly important. And like I said at the beginning, when you understand these true and simple principles, it makes our monetary system really easy. Because what would be happening today if this is the money we used? It'd be simple. Everyone would know, well, that's $1. And it has the same purchasing power it always has had. It's 371.25 grains of silver. Okay? Whereas this goes all over the place. They just print it however they want to. They make whatever, just entries into computers, etc. This is real money. This is the ghost of money, right? Okay? Now, in order to understand this Article 1, Section 8, Clause 5, Congress shall have the power to coin money, we need to look at another part of the Constitution where it talks about coining money, okay? And this is in Article 1, Section 10, Clause 1, wherein it says, no state shall coin money. Okay, so we do a little pop quiz here. Can states coin money? No. Can the Congress coin money? Yes. Why? That's what it says in the Constitution, and it makes sense with principles of liberty. Okay? Okay, moving on to the next part of Article 1, Section 10, Clause 1, it says, no state shall emit bills of credit. What does it mean to emit a bill of credit? They can't do it, but what's it mean? Well, here's what it means. You got a bar of gold, right? You're carrying around this big bar of gold in your pocket. You're like, this would be a lot more convenient if I just gave it to a bank. They'll safely deposit it, and they'll give me a little piece of paper that says the bearer of this note has 100 pounds of gold in store at our vault at this bank. They essentially give you a bill of credit. Okay? You have a credit of $100 worth of gold in their vault. Okay? So they issue this bill. That's a bill of credit. Emitting a bill of credit is issuing a bill of credit. It's printing paper money to represent the real money that's in store somewhere in value. Okay, that's what emitting a bill of credit is. Essentially what it is, it's an IOU, okay? If I turn that in, the bank will give me my bar of gold, okay? It's an instrument of debt. This piece of paper means that that bank owes me this when I give that back to them, okay? Now, when I give them back the bill of credit, they give me back my gold. That's what emitting a bill of credit is. So, no state shall emit bills of credit. Can states do that? Can states print paper money to represent the gold that they have on hand? No. Explicitly it says they can't emit bills of credit. Okay? Why not? Well, because the reason why not is because the temptation is simply too great to print more paper than there really is gold. Okay? And that process is called fractional reserve banking. To print more money and only have a fraction of the money that's out there represented by your real money, your real gold on hand. Okay? Now, what happens when the four people who have these bills come to collect their bar of gold that the bill of credit says they can collect? What happens? Well, the only real answer at this point is divide that bar of gold up into four. So all of a sudden, the people who have a note that says I have $100 worth, only going to get $25 worth of gold. And what happens in reality, in the real world? That news spreads like wildfire, and there's a run on the bank, and the bank shuts down, closes their doors. Okay? And the paper money that people are left holding becomes worthless, essentially. So government's role is to protect people from this happening, to protect them from having their property stolen, not to participate in it. So it only makes sense. That's why Article 1, Section 10, Clause 1 says states can't participate in emitting bills of credit. The temptation is just too high to print bills when they're not backed up by gold. Okay? Now, it's very clear states can't do that, but can Congress? What does Article 1, Section 8, Clause 5 say about Congress emitting bills of credit? It's silent, isn't it? It doesn't say they can emit bills of credit. It doesn't say they can't emit bills of credit. So what do we do when the Constitution is silent on an issue? There is explicit language in the Constitution that addresses this issue, and it's called the 10th Amendment. Okay? Here's what the 10th Amendment says. The powers that are not delegated to the United States by the Constitution. Let's be clear here. What are we talking about? We're talking about the power to print paper money, aren't we? So, the power to print paper money is not delegated to the United States by the Constitution. Okay? Is that true? Yeah, it was never delegated. It was never explicitly delegated. Now, the power to print paper money is prohibited by it to the states. We already read that, right? They can't emit bills of credit. Therefore, the 10th Amendment says those powers reserved to the states respectively, unless they're prohibited, which they are, or to the people. So very clearly, the 10th Amendment says if the power is not delegated to the United States, it isn't there. So the fact that the Constitution never delegated to Congress, to the United States, the power to print paper money means that Congress doesn't have that power. That's what the 10th Amendment clearly states. Okay, so very clearly, this power to emit bills of credit, to print paper money, Congress can't do it, 10th Amendment. States can't do it, Article 1, Section 10. But according to the 10th Amendment, the people can. It's still reserved to the people. Can you and I emit bills of credit? Can I take a piece of paper and say, I owe you for your truck, I owe you $10,000. And if you want to do it, can you? Sure. I'd be glad to do that. But we can trade. If I want to trade a chicken for a cow, can I do that? Yes. You can trade whatever you want to. You can emit bills of credit. People have that right. So if the people can issue bills of credit, can print paper money, can private banks print paper money? Sure. They're just entities of the people, right? They can print paper money. And if they want to print paper money, if they want to stay in business, they're going to back up that paper money with gold. Okay? Otherwise, people are going to say, wait, how do I know this is monopoly money? It doesn't have any value. What's going on here? Now, if I want to start a bank, and I think it's going to be much more convenient for people, so I start issuing paper money called Jeff Hymas notes, and people want to use that, that's great. Okay? There's a built-in natural law there that stops me from fractional reserve banking, though. Why? Because if you're smart, if you're wise, you're not going to take a bill from me unless you've first given me gold in return. Otherwise, you're going to know, look, I'm just taking money that has no backing to it. You're going to make sure you give that to me, okay? Now, what if my partner in crime, I am printing a bunch of bills and giving it to him, and we start to inflate the money supply. We start to put out more money out there and just over and over inflate the market. What happens? The same thing when each of those four people are holding their $100 bill, right? When they come to turn it in for gold, they realize, hey, that's not there. But what's the mechanism which people realize, hey, my gold isn't there? Because what if everyone just traded in paper money? They never even go and bother to trade it in for gold because it's much more convenient. Everyone accepts paper money. Why even mess around with the gold? So what's the mechanism for people to realize, wait a second, they're printing money, paper money that doesn't have any gold behind it. There is a mechanism in the Constitution. Let's look at that. It's really fascinating. It's the next part of Article 1, Section 10, Clause 1. It says, no state shall make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts. Okay? No state shall make anything but gold and silver coin a tender in payment of debts. So, does government have the privilege of printing paper money to pay for their debts? No. Government has to use gold and silver coin to pay their debts and to receive payment for their debts. So, when it comes time for you and me who are trading in Jeff Hymas notes to pay our taxes to our state and federal government, what do we have to do? Can we pay them in paper money? No, not according to the Constitution. We have to turn in our paper money for gold, and that's the mechanism. We show up to get our gold and say, oh shoot, sorry, you only get a quarter of the gold that you had on deposit because we printed too many notes. We printed too much paper money against that. That's the mechanism. So it keeps the issuer of the paper money honest because they know that people have to turn in their paper money for gold at least yearly, often, much more often. And so that paper money is controlled naturally in the free market because of this call for the government to only accept gold and silver coin as payment in debts. But is that what's happening today? No. In fact, the exact opposite is happening. I'm going to read this to make sure I get it clear, okay? Government not only allows fractional reserve banking, inflation, and printing of paper money, but it has taken it many, many steps further by doing the exact opposite of what the Constitution calls for, by disallowing gold and silver to be used as legal tender, by only allowing paper money to be used as legal tender, and by granting a monopoly over the printing of the paper money and the accompanying interest rates of its loan rate to a private entity called the Federal Reserve. Okay? So the reason we have some monetary problems is because we're not following the Constitution. And in fact, we're doing the exact opposite and to the nth degree of what the Constitution tells us we need to do, which is allowing government to defraud, giving government the power to inflate fractional reserve, give power to the Federal Reserve to do these things, do exactly the opposite of what the Constitution calls for. Here's a little quiz for you. What is constitutional money? Is this constitutional money? Is this constitutional money? Now here's a question that even after going through this presentation, people get confused. What about this money right here? Is that constitutional money? It's backed up by gold, so is it constitutional? No. Coining money is coining money. It doesn't matter what type of stamp it has that says it's worth, it's still paper money. The only constitutional money is coin, because coins represent real value and cannot be manipulated and printed at will at the government's pleasure. Okay? That's why they said they should coin money. There's a very simple concept. It's a principle of freedom to protect the property of people. To explain that more clearly, this has a certain content, purity, and weight. It has real value in it. That's why it's real money. And this is just representative of real money. That's the difference. Okay? What else does the Constitution have to say about money? There's a lot. Article 1, Section 8, Clause 6 says, Congress shall have power to provide for the punishment of counterfeiting the securities and current coin of the United States. In the Mint Act of 1792, the same one they used to define the dollar to be 371.25 grains of silver, in that same act, they used their power in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 6 to define the punishment for defrauding, for counterfeiting the coin of the United States. What was the punishment? It was a capital offense. It was death. If you defraud the current coin of the United States, you were guilty of death. Why is that? Because if you manipulate and control our money, you manipulate and control our government. A little hypocritical today, right? That's exactly what the government's doing. And yet they're the ones who are supposed to be protecting us from that happening. And that's where our Constitution is written, to protect that from happening. And the government's taken the opposite side, said, no, we're going to do what we like to do. We're going to get involved in the monetary market, and we're going to try to save the monetary system by doing what we're not authorized to do. And in the course, what have they done? They destroyed the monetary system, which only makes sense. You violate principles of freedom, you will reap the consequences. Okay? Next, Article 1, Section 8, Clause 2, Congress shall have power to borrow money on the credit of the United States. Now, when I first did this presentation, I didn't even address this. Even though it says borrow money, it actually has the word money in there. I didn't put it in my money in the Constitution presentation because it bugged me. This is the whole problem, right? They're borrowing money over and over and over. But when you look at it, it becomes very clear that the two key words in this that the founders implemented was to borrow money, okay? Not to print money and not to borrow paper money, but to borrow money. In times of war, for example, when they couldn't generate enough money to pay for war, can they borrow money from Austria, from other countries, from Germany? Yeah, they can. But what type of money? The money type of money. They can borrow money from other nations, right? And any nation who lends us money, if they have half a brain, they're going to say there's a contract here. You borrow this money, you pay us this much back. So the Congress can, instead of levying taxes to pay for something, they do have the authority under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 2 to borrow money on the credit of the United States. They can do that. But once again, it's not printing money, it's not borrowing paper money, it's borrowing money. Okay? It's interesting, this Article 1, Section 8, Clause 2 came directly from the previous Articles of Confederation, wherein it said this: Congress shall have power to borrow money or to emit bills on the credit of the United States. That's what the Articles of Confederation stood for and allowed. But the founders said, no. We reject this. They actually removed that provision from Article 1, Section 8, Clause 2, or from the original Articles of Confederation. And when it came into Article 1, Section 8, Clause 2, it had emit bills of credit removed. So the founders directly looked at paper money in the eyes, not only historically, not only with their quotes and the principles, but also to look at what they did in the convention itself. They said paper money will not be allowed in our Constitution. We do not have the power to emit bills of credit. Okay? So I don't know how many more times I can say that. Congress can't print money. Okay? It's very clear in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 2, and all the other different provisions we looked at. They can't do that. Let's look at two more articles and develop a model around them that I think are quite interesting. Article 1, Section 7, Clause 1 says, all bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House of Representatives. Article 1, Section 9, Clause 7 says, no money shall be drawn from the Treasury but in consequence of appropriations made by law. So it's very, very clear that Congress is in charge, specifically the House, for raising revenue. They're in charge of the money, right? They say that the purse strings are in the House. They're in charge of the purse. And they have to make a law in order to pull money out of the Treasury. Very, very simple. What's in the Treasury? The gold and silver coin that people paid in taxes. If that's going to come out, the House of Representatives has to write a law to pull it out for a specific purpose. What's that purpose? Within the proper role of government, to protect the rights of the citizens. Period. It's that easy. It's really not a complex system. So now let's look at the model around these two clauses we just talked about. This is prior to 1913, okay? Prior to the 16th and 17th Amendments and prior to the Federal Reserve Act. All three of those happened in 1913. Okay, who is in charge in America? Principally, theoretically, on principle, the people are in charge, right? Now the people hire, according to the last two clauses we just read, the people hire someone to manage their money. Who is that? The House of Representatives. That's who the people hire, is the House of Representatives. They elect them, okay? Now, on the other hand, prior to 1913, we have state legislatures. And who do they hire to represent their interests? They hire the U.S. Senate. Remember, this is prior to the 17th Amendment, which destroyed that relationship. Now, the basis behind Republican government is the idea of representation. When you hire someone to work for you, they do what you want them to do. So what does the House of Representatives do? They look to their constituency, to the people, and say, what do you want us to do? The people say, well, how about you give us a free lunch bill? And the House says, well, you're our constituents. Okay, we'll do that. So they write up a free lunch bill, and it gets sent to the U.S. Senate. And what's the U.S. Senate say? Let's ask our constituency, the state, do you guys want to do this? You're our constituents. And the state says, well, I don't know. Let me ask my constituency. Let's ask the people. Hey, people, do you guys want to increase taxes in order to pay for this free lunch bill? People say, no, we wanted a free lunch bill, not a lunch bill, a free lunch bill. No, don't do that. Don't raise taxes. So state legislature says, hey, Senate, kill that bill. We don't want it to pass. And what happens? The Senate kills the bill. This process is set up originally in the Constitution, before the 16th and 17th Amendment, before the Federal Reserve Act. What did it do? It provided a check and balance on who? On the people. It protected them from the ludicrous idea that you can get something for nothing. Because once they realize, we have to pay for it? Oh, we don't want it then. That this check and balance system was set up that way to make sure that it wouldn't just be going and try to get a bunch of free lunch bills, okay? Now, this is all based on three critical principles, okay? The first principle is representation. Originally, the two legislative branches represent two different bodies, right? The House represents the people, and the Senate represents the states. Secondly, payment for programs comes through taxes. People can decide if the bill or the program or the war, or name your favorite issue, is worth the rise in their taxes. There's a direct pay. If you want this, you have to pay for it. Oh yeah, no, we don't want to pay for it. Never mind, we don't want it that bad. Okay? That's the second principle. Direct payment for what you get. So the third point is direct tax collection. Okay, prior to the 16th Amendment, only the states can collect taxes directly from the people. Okay? This is upheld in this Article 1, Section 2, Clause 3. It says, direct taxes shall be apportioned among the several states which may be included in this union according to their respective numbers. Okay? The only way for the federal government to get money is for the states to directly tax their people. And that's why they asked the people, do you want us to tax you? They said, no, don't tax us. Well, then tell the senators not to vote for that bill. Exactly, okay? One other point of interest here with the idea that only states can collect taxes from their people to pay the federal government, okay, this check and balance, is the federal government won't dare go out and borrow money from other nations unless they know the states are going to be able to collect from their citizens to pay back the Congress for that decision. Therefore, that's why Congress is in charge of deciding whether or not they want to go and borrow money. And who's Congress? It's the people's representatives in the House, but it's the state's representatives in the Senate. If the state says, don't borrow that money because we're not going to pay you back, we're not going to go ask our citizens to pay for that loan or pay for that, whatever it may be, they'll be able to control their senators and say, don't do that. Otherwise, Congress will go off and make a loan or get a loan, and then the states say, we're not going to collect the money. That's where the check and balance comes into play. If the states only can get the money from the people, prior to the 16th Amendment, only the states can collect it, then Congress, meaning the Senate, better know for sure if the state legislature will support them in doing that. The way they know that is because the state legislature appoints them to be their senators. That's how the state's interests are represented. Now, let's look at it after 1913. This is after the 16th Amendment, 17th Amendment, the Federal Reserve Act, all that happened in 1913. We're going to look at this little system. Who's in charge still? The people are in charge, and we still hire the House of Representatives. But now, the people also hire the U.S. Senate, okay? Direct popular election. Why is that? Because of the 17th Amendment. What happens to the state legislatures? Well, the 17th Amendment says the states, you're out. You don't have any say. You're out of the picture. The people are in charge here. This is a popular election now. The states no longer have their interests represented at the national level, at the federal level. Okay? Now, people would argue, well, there's still accountability. The House and Senate, right? They're accountable to their constituents, to the people. They say, hey, what do you want us to do? And the people say, oh, now let's do a free lunch bill. Well, the problem is they still have to go back to them and say, hey, look, guys, do you really want to increase taxes for that bill? And they say, no, don't raise taxes, right? They go back to them and say, we don't want to raise taxes. It's the same check and balance, isn't it? Except that with the introduction of the Federal Reserve Act, the Federal Reserve comes in and says, you don't ever have to have that uncomfortable conversation. We'll provide the money for those programs. Okay? Federal Reserve comes in and says, we will pay the money for those programs. Do people like that? Sure. Someone else is going to pay for it? Yeah, I like that. Do politicians like that? You bet. I can give the people all they want and they don't have to even get taxed for it. Guess what? My chances of re-election just went through the roof. I'm going to get re-elected because I can give them everything they want and they don't have to pay for it. Does the Federal Reserve like it? Yes, because they have the monopoly power to set the interest rates. When they loan money, when they print that money, they don't do so just for fun. The people themselves are on the hook to pay the interest back for that. But they don't tell the people that. They just print the money and pay for it. Okay? It's a pretty tight system, isn't it? Pretty nice. Which brings us to the 16th Amendment, okay? What happens in the 16th Amendment? 16th Amendment is where the federal government can now tax the people directly. This federal income tax. Now, the federal income tax, Ronald Reagan had some curiosity about it, found out, where does all this money for the federal income tax go? So he issued a commission called the Grace Commission Report. And guess what it found? This report found that 100% of all the federal income tax went to pay who? The Federal Reserve, for the interest on the debt they created by printing paper money to cover all these programs that we wanted and didn't think we had to pay for. So who gets hosed at the end? The people do. They're the ones that have to pay for it. They just don't realize it because the system's set up in such a way that it's never directly in front of their face to say they have to pay for it. So after 1913, it virtually destroyed this whole model, didn't it? Why? Because look at our three critical principles again. Representation. Two legislative bodies represented two groups of people, the people and the states. What was that? It was destroyed by the 17th Amendment. What about the idea of direct payment for programs through taxes? Well, don't worry. The Federal Reserve Act took care of that. Well, you don't have to pay for it. We'll pay for it. We'll eventually pay for it, but we're going to pay for it now. You won't realize it. And what about direct tax collection? Well, through the 16th Amendment, the federal government was able to collect taxes in order to pay the Federal Reserve on the interest rate of the paper money that they just printed. Okay? So what happened? We destroyed the Constitution in that area in the 16th and 17th Amendments and through the Federal Reserve Act. and we debilitated the prohibitions on government from doing these things that created a free market and money system that worked, and created a system that was advantageous to who? The power brokers and the government, big business, corporate cronyism, etc., etc. Kind of interesting, or kind of maddening, what they did, okay? Now, Chief Justice John Marshall said this: among the enumerated powers, we do not find that of establishing a bank. Is he right? Yes, there's never a specific enumerated power that allows them to establish a bank, but he took the logic that too many people take. Here's the logic he said: but because the Constitution does not expressly prohibit one, we can establish a national bank. It's constitutional. That's in defiance of what the 10th Amendment says, right? 10th Amendment says if the power is not given, it's not there. The 10th Amendment doesn't say, oh, as long as it doesn't prohibit it, you can do it. That's not what it says. It says there's specifically delineated, delegated powers, and if those aren't in that list, you can't do them. The power to establish a public bank, national bank, was not there, but they did it anyway, okay? The first national bank comes into existence. Hamilton was very much a proponent of the national bank, okay? Through some different political things that happened, Jefferson was able to shut down the first national bank. He said it's a bad thing. They shut it down, okay? The second national bank comes and revives and is established, okay? Andrew Jackson ran his whole entire political campaign on shutting down the national bank. Now, Andrew Jackson is a fairly colorful figure. I don't know enough about his past to put a judgment one way or the other whether he was good for freedom or bad for freedom. But in this area of wanting to shut down the national bank, he was right on, okay? Here's what he said. This is a little paper clipping from a newspaper. I'm going to read you a quote of what he said in front of the board of directors of the U.S. National Bank. He said, "Gentlemen, I too have been a close observer of the doings of the Bank of the United States. I have been watching you for a long time and am convinced that you have used the funds of the bank to speculate in the breadstuffs of the country. When you won, you divided the profits amongst you, and when you lost, you charged it to the bank. When it's a nationalized bank, who takes the losses? The people, right? It's nationalized. You tell me that if I take the deposits from the bank and annul its charter, I shall ruin 10,000 families. That may be true, gentlemen, but that is your sin. Should I let you go on, you will ruin 50,000 families, and that would be my sin. You're a den of vipers and thieves. I have determined to rout you out, and by the eternal," and then he slams his fist on the rostrum and says, "I will rout you out." Cool, huh? He says, "I will rout you out." And what happened? The second national bank got shut down. The charter was annulled. Okay? So we had the first national bank shut down by Jefferson, the second national bank shut down by Jackson. Did we ever have a third national bank? Yes, but did they call it a national bank? No. What did they call it? The Federal Reserve, okay? 1913 was a horrible year. Just to review real quick. In the Wilson administration, they passed the 16th Amendment, they passed the 17th Amendment, and they passed this central bank, the Federal Reserve System. And don't forget, plank number 5 of the Communist Manifesto is to have a centralized monopoly and issuing power in a central bank like the Federal Reserve. Okay? There's a man named Rothschild. You'll hear this name if you learn much about the evils of the world. Okay? Rothschild says this: "Let us control the money of a nation, and we care not who makes its laws." Is that true? He who controls the money controls the nation, don't they? Okay? And that's very true. Rothschild and his family, his ilk, had been starting central banks throughout the world. Okay? They're very much highly involved in starting the national bank here in America as well. Now let's look at the Federal Reserve for a second. What is the Federal Reserve? Anyone heard of FOIA, Freedom of Information Act? Okay? If you're a government entity, a citizen of the United States can say, "I want to look at your books because you're a government entity. I want to look freely at your information." In 2009, in an attempt to avoid a Freedom of Information Act request, the Federal Reserve Bank of New York Board of Governors, which is essentially the Board of Governors for the Federal Reserve, said this: "The Federal Reserve Bank of New York is not an establishment of the executive branch." They also said, "It is a corporation whose stock is privately held. It is overseen by a board of directors, the majority of whom are privately appointed. And none of the stock of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York is government-owned." So in other words, we're not part of the government. We don't have to open our books. I don't care if your Freedom of Information Act says that government entities have to open their books. We're not a government entity. So they admitted openly what they've been denying for so many years. Oh no, we're part of the government. They're not part of the government at all. Even they say that. They're not part of the government. Okay? They're a private entity. So the best way to understand what is the Federal Reserve? Well, the first thing is the Federal Reserve is not federal, right? It's not tied to the government, and it is not a reserve. Okay? The Federal Reserve is more or less a computer system. Okay? Now, does the Federal Reserve have a lot of gold? Yeah, they're not stupid. They play this dollar game, this Federal Reserve note. What do? They turn the Federal Reserve notes into gold because they know gold has value. When they can pump paper money in the system and then convert that paper money into gold, they do that every chance they get because they know that only gold has value. Even their own money they're printing, they're afraid to store. They know it's not worth anything. Okay? So Federal Reserve, not federal, not a reserve. Okay. We shouldn't be laughing, right? We should be crying at this point. Now, the Federal Reserve Act of 1913, it was an act to provide for the establishment of Federal Reserve banks to furnish an elastic currency. And the key word in that is elastic. What's elastic mean? When the economy is going good, you can inflate the money supply. You can make all kinds of loans. That's how you make money. When you want to turn things around, you can restrict the money supply and call out people's loans, say you need to pay, and you can seize their assets because they can't pay for it. Elastic means you control the interest rates. You control the ebb and flow of the money supply. Okay? Which is frustrating. They were able to do that, though, because they had control. They had monopoly power from the government to do what they wanted to do, the Federal Reserve did, in this act. Gresham's law says this: bad money drives good money out of circulation. So once again, if I come to you and say, hey, I owe you $1, which one do you want? Well, give me the real money, right? You're going to take that, aren't you? And if you turn around to your friend and say, I owe you $1, hey, here's your $1, you're going to keep this under your bed, aren't you? What's going to happen? Bad money drives good money out of circulation. People start sticking this under their bed and start circulating the paper money. Because this is bad money. I'm going to keep the good money. I'm not going to circulate it. Bad money drives good money out of circulation. And that's exactly what was happening in 1933. Okay, people were hoarding, according to FDR, they were hoarding the gold and silver, and they're making the Depression worse, according to FDR. The people were simply acting like logical human beings and saying, we know this paper money is worth nothing. We're going to keep the gold and silver under our beds. And so what did FDR do? He made an executive order that every American shall turn in their gold, period. You will turn it into the federal government, or else we will jail you for 6 months or fine you $10,000. And so what did the people do? Dutifully and patriotically, they turned in all their gold. Does that strike you as odd? It should be odd, because they're stealing from the people, taking from them their gold. Now, what's interesting, at that time, gold was worth about $20.67 an ounce. People turned in their gold, and the government gave them $20.67 worth of Federal Reserve notes. What happened after that? After FDR got a lot of the gold in the system, he said, okay, well now gold is worth $35 an ounce. Wait a second. Government just made billions of dollars on this illegal transaction that tricked the people into thinking it was patriotic to turn their gold into the country. Okay? Kind of a challenge there. Now, the rule was that Americans couldn't turn their Federal Reserve notes in for gold, but foreigners still could. Okay? But foreigners knew that Americans weren't doing it, so they didn't need to. They felt like their gold was secure. By 1971, all the foreigners, give me my gold, and they started turning their Federal Reserve notes quickly, almost like a run on the bank, and gold is flying out of the country. So Richard Nixon took us in 1971 off the gold standard. No longer was the Federal Reserve note tied at all to the gold standard, okay? Because it couldn't be turned in by anybody for gold. Even foreigners are cut off in 1971. And from then on, our Federal Reserve note was a complete and total fiat currency. Okay? Is there a problem there? Yeah, minor. Because they can print this thing to oblivion. There's some challenges there, aren't there? So why did the people accept the Federal Reserve Act? Well, propaganda, just like always, right? The media says, man, our inflation's out of control. It's going all over the place. It's erratic. Well, if you look at this chart, it pops up every once in a while where there's some wars, right? Where they inflate the money supply to pay, and then they pay it back down, up and down, up and down. But then you get to 1913. Look at the cumulative effect from 1600s there to 1913. How much had it changed? Very, very little. Okay? Inflation was not out of control. And they said it was. We need to get it back in control. And from 1913 on, look what happened. It was completely in control, right? In their control. What happened in inflation? It skyrocketed because from 1913 on, they started to have the power to print money and to inflate the money supply. Okay, so they tricked us. What's inflation? A lot of people think it's a rise in prices. Is inflation a rise in prices? No, inflation is an increase in the amount of money in the system, okay, which results in a rise in prices. Inflation is injecting more money into the system. printing it out of thin air. And there's two bad things that happen to us when they print money. Okay? The current money we have is worth less because there's more out in circulation. Okay? It was one of only $1,000 bills in circulation, and now they dumped 10 million into the system. Now it's one of $10 million bills. So the price is going to go up. It's going to cost you $1,000 to buy a loaf of bread instead of $1 to buy a loaf of bread. So that dollar you had that could have bought you a loaf of bread yesterday now can only buy you 1/100th of a loaf of bread today. It decreases the purchasing value of the dollar in your pocket. The other thing is it puts you, so the first part is it devalues your purchasing power of your dollar. The second thing is it puts you on the hook to pay interest for the money that the Federal Reserve printed out of thin air. They don't do it for fun. They print it and say, we're going to charge you 5%. And who's on the hook to pay that interest back? The people. Our purchasing power is devalued, and we're on the hook to pay interest for that. Okay? So you guys have probably heard of a famous economist called Milton Friedman. Okay, this sign here says, inflation is taxation without legislation. We're never taxed unless there's a legislative bill that comes across and says, just like we read previously, we're going to pull money out of the Treasury. And that legislation has to come up, and it's brought forward by our representatives, our senators, and they will therefore tax us. But what happens with inflation? They simply have, oh, don't worry about it. We'll just have the Federal Reserve print a bunch of paper money to pay for it. And then there was no legislation. We never had a chance to look at it, never had a chance to tell our senators and representatives, nor to hold them accountable for providing the money for these programs and entitlements, et cetera, that we aren't in agreement with. Because inflation is kind of an invisible way to tax the people without ever having legislation that asks for the permission to tax us. Here's the way John Maynard Keynes put it. Now, John Maynard Keynes, Keynesian economics, okay, I have an MBA. I went through a master's program with economics and business. Keynesian economics is the standard nowadays. Keynesian economics says if there's a problem, what you need to do is you need to spend your way out of that problem. It's ridiculous, okay? But here's what he said. By a continuous process of inflation, governments can confiscate secretly and unobserved an important part of the wealth of their citizens in a manner that not one man in a million can diagnose. Essentially, what's he saying? He's saying three things. Rob you blind. That's what he's saying. We can rob you blind because not one man in a million will realize I was robbed today by my government because they're printing money without me authorizing it. They're taxing me. They're taking it out of my pocket, and I never authorized that to happen. Inflation does that. Are there any economists who realize that we need the gold standard? Yeah, there's a very famous economist. Here's what he said. In the absence of the gold standard, there is no way to protect savings from confiscation through inflation. You have to have the gold standard. Otherwise, you continue to inflate the money supply and steal from people. You can do that. We have to have the gold standard. Who said that? Alan Greenspan. Okay, Alan Greenspan was a gold bug. He was very much a proponent of the gold standard, and yet for the last 30 years, he was the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and very much was a changed man, a proponent of inflation, a proponent of paper money, a proponent of interest rate manipulation. Okay? Henry Hazlitt, a famous economist, said this. Inflation tears apart the whole fabric of stable economic relationships. It drives men towards desperate remedies. It leads men to demand totalitarian controls. It ends invariably in bitter disillusion and collapse. If you want to talk about extreme inflation, let's talk about Germany, okay? In November of 1919, 170 German marks were equal to 1 ounce of gold. By November of 1923, just 4 years later, it was 87 trillion marks were worth 1 ounce of gold. That's called super hyperinflation, okay? There's stories of women who would come to collect the paycheck of their men every 4 hours at their lunch break to go spend their money at the store before it inflated again. Okay, that's superinflation. What happened in Germany? It drove men to demand totalitarian controls. Who did Germany ask to come solve their problems? Germany asked Hitler. Okay? They demanded totalitarian controls. That's the problem. Government causes problems, and then they provide the solution in more government. It's the story of history. That's what the government always does. That inflation tears apart the whole fabric of stable relationships. Okay? That's the challenge we face. It's not some small little potatoes thing. It's a big deal. Inflation can destroy any government, any country. Okay, with the Federal Reserve, do they just print money within the United States, and do they just put the citizens of the United States on the hook to pay interest? No. They also do that internationally, okay? There was a bill that was put forward by Ron Paul to audit the Fed, okay? And in that bill, it got watered down a lot, but it finally made it through. It was a very, very watered down bill. But what it found is, in this audit, during a 2.5-year period starting at the end of 2007, the Federal Reserve provided more than $16 trillion in secret bailouts to banks and other companies around the world. Okay? Interesting. Look at this list, okay? You got France, United Kingdom, Switzerland. Are there any banks on there that are United States banks? Yeah, $16 trillion. I'll tell you about a slight conflict of interest. J.P. Morgan Chase, one of their VPs, sits on the board of directors for the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve paid J.P. Morgan Chase $391 billion. Is that a conflict of interest? Slight. Okay, you work for J.P. Morgan Chase and you're sitting on the Federal Reserve board of directors and your bank gets paid $391 billion. These are secret loans. These are loans that they didn't make public. They're loans they give it out to the tune of $16 trillion. The Federal Reserve printing $16 trillion worth of money, of paper money, into the system, which devalues our purchasing power of our dollar because there's $16 trillion more of it out on the market. Now, what about the loans in France, the loans in Switzerland? We're not on the hook to pay interest on that, but the citizens of France and Switzerland are on the hook to pay for that interest on the debt that they issued. Okay? Now, this is in addition to the $850 billion authorized for TARP. We all went crazy about $850 billion. Well, what's $16 trillion? It's magnitudes bigger than $850 billion. Okay? We're going to end with a quote here. Jefferson said this: "I believe that banking institutions are more dangerous to our liberties than standing armies." Can you see why now? Yeah. If the American people ever allow private banks to control the issue of their currency, first by inflation, then by deflation, is that what's happening? Yes, the private bank, the Federal Reserve, inflates and deflates the money supply. And do they control that? Can people close to them make a bundle of money during inflationary periods and a bundle of money during deflationary periods? Yes, because they know the market. They're making the market. Okay? The banks and corporations that will grow up around the banks will deprive the people of all property until their children wake up homeless on the continent their fathers conquered. The epitome of corporate cronyism. Okay? They're going to have these banks and corporations that grow up around and say, hey, hand me this. I want this favor. I'll scratch your back. You scratch mine. And it's all the elitists who understand how to work the money system instead of a simple money system that the people are protected under. And they simply engage in simple commerce. The issuing power should be taken from the banks and restored to the people to whom it properly belongs. What does that mean? How do you restore the issuing power back to the people? Here's how. If it's just gold and silver coin, who controls the gold and silver in the world? People who own mines, right? Just like anyone who controls the wheat of the world. Well, the people own farms and grow wheat. If, like any commodity, it's in their best interest and it's worth the money to invest the labor and time and equipment to mine gold and silver out of the ground, they will do that. Okay? And that's how money is issued. What do they do with that gold? If they want to use it in commerce, they could just hand someone a nugget and say, hey, this is gold and it weighs this much purity. Will you take it so I can have your automobile? We'll trade. I'll pay for your automobile with this. Well, people who mine those gold as miners, they're going to take the gold and they take it to the government. The U.S. government stamps it and it says it does have a certain quantity and purity and content of gold in it. And that way, when I go to buy it, the person who at the dealership is going to say, yeah, U.S. has stamped that this is what's in it. Okay, I'll take that. I might not take your nugget because I'm not really sure what it is. But since the U.S. Mint has stamped this and given their approval for what it is, yeah, okay, I'll go ahead and take that. And who's in charge of the issuing of currency that way? The people. Who's in charge of the market with gold and silver? The people. Okay? It's very simple that way. Government's out of it. They're not involved in that market. They can't manipulate it. They're simply protecting and establishing what is legal tender, which should be gold and silver, according to the Constitution, and those coins that are coined, what the purity and content and weight of those coins are. So the last slide, what can be done? This is particular to this presentation. We need to introduce competing currencies, okay? Congress can do so because Article 1, Section 8, Clause 5. We have to have competing currencies. It demands that they coin money. They're not coining money nowadays. They've given the monopolistic currency to the Federal Reserve, a private entity. In the state legislatures, according to Article 1, Section 10, Clause 1, it calls for gold and silver coin to be that competing currency. Because, once again, if we have a competing currency, which one am I going to take? I'm going to take this one. And eventually, this one will go out of existence because people realize this is only paper. It's not worth anything. Competing currencies let the best rise to the top, which will be the coin. Okay? Secondly, we need to repeal legal tender laws. Okay, legal tender gives the monopoly power to the Federal Reserve. Number 3, this is interesting. We need to reduce spending first, then reduce taxation. We're always talking about we got to get rid of taxes, got to lower taxes. What we need to do is spend only on constitutionally allowed programs and agencies and etc. Okay, that's what you have to do. Focus on that first. Number 4, abolish the Federal Reserve step by step. You've probably heard that before. We need to abolish the Federal Reserve. Maybe it sounded a little bit overboard, a little bit radical. But hopefully after this presentation you realize not only do we have to do it, we have to do it quickly. Okay? There's no question. It's tanking. There's no way it can. Mathematically, it can't work. Okay? Federal Reserve issuing paper money, just more and more and more, and saying the people have to pay the interest on that paper money with paper money that they produce. It's illogical. It's going down the drains. Okay, so we need to do it. Now, it's step by step. We can't abolish this Federal Reserve tomorrow. Okay, but it is step by step. We have to be serious about it because it is going to fall, and we have to choose to bring it down gently rather than just let it completely crash and suffer the consequences. Now, state legislatures need to send resolutions to Congress advocating these measures. We need to stand up and we need to stand on our own 2 feet, not only sending resolutions to the U.S. Congress, but to stand on our own 2 feet and pass legal tender laws. Say gold and silver coin, according to Article 1, Section 10, Clause 1, will be used in this state. We need to start taking measures to stand for principles of freedom. Lastly, tremendous grassroots effort to educate and to advocate for these changes. Because what we know, what if everyone in this community knew that? What if everyone in the state, what if everyone in the nation knew it? We'd be able to change things, wouldn't we? Okay? So I hope we can do what the founders did. The founders said, look, let's look back to history. Paper money doesn't work. Let's look back to our own mistakes. In the Revolutionary War, we issued the Continental Dollar. We inflated it to no end. Let's be humble and let's say we've done this wrong. Let's get back to the principles of the Constitution and restore soundness to our money system in the Constitution.